One of the differences between the Church of England and the Episcopal Church, a difference which took me quite a while to get over when I went to Chicago, is that we sing different hymns, and some of the hymns that are well known, we sing to different tunes on either side of the Atlantic. But there are hymns in one country that the other country doesn't use. One of them is Come Labour On, and it was a joy to sing it again because the tune was written by a former director of music at York Minster. So I'm not the only little bit of York that you've got with you this morning. I've been the Dean of York for about 10 months now, and it's an extraordinary place to be, and I am still very much finding my feet. By way of scale, my entire staff, when I was at St. James Cathedral in Chicago, where I spent 7 very happy years, I employ more stonemasons in York than I did the entire staff of the cathedral in Chicago. So I am still finding my feet, and there's a lot that I don't know about the place that I work. But I want to just give a little talk, and if I've timed this well, there should be time for questions before the 11 o'clock service happens. I just want to give a little bit of sense about the most important thing about York, which is that it's a story of a living tradition of good news cast in mission and ministry and in stone and glass. And I want to say to you that it is in this that we conquer. And if you don't get the illusion now, you will in a couple of moments. So we're talking about a really famous church, an enormous church. That's its West End. If you walk into the city from the railway station, for instance, that is the view that greets you. It's often claimed to be the largest Gothic cathedral north of the Alps. All that depends on how you measure it, but it's an oft-repeated claim. It's got the widest and highest nave of any of England's medieval cathedrals. It has by far the most important collection of painted and stained glass, because stained glass is quite modern. They painted it before they stained it. I'm told by the head of what we call the York Glaziers Trust that if there was some extraordinary calamity and every medieval church in Europe fell to the ground except the Minster, the glass that we have would be enough for somebody to come and learn everything they needed to learn about European ancient stained glass within our one building. And it has, since the 8th century, been the seat of one of the 2 archbishoprics of England. Canterbury is not the only archbishop in the Church of England. There are 2, and the other one has his seat in that building. So it is quite a place. It is, without any doubt, the most significant historic building in northern England. But let's talk about how it got there. In the beginning, in the case and the story of York, in the beginning were the Romans. In the early 70s, 71 or 72, they founded a major garrison fort on a rather suitable mound that was at the junction of 2 rivers, and they named it Eboracum. There's no trace of any kind of significant settlement of any kind prior to the Romans arriving. And alongside the garrison, a civilian settlement and population began to grow up, and by the 3rd century it had been recognized as a colonia, from which we get the word colony, of course. That was the highest rank of a Roman city. So it had become a really important place, both for military and civilian purposes. That's an artistic representation of how it might have looked. You can see one of the rivers going through the centre, the garrison above it, and the civilian town beneath the river, and just to the right there is the second river coming in. So that's a sense of what it might have looked like back in, let's say, the 3rd or 4th century. And then in 306, something really significant happens. Significant not for York, but I would say for the entire world. On the 25th of July, the Roman Emperor Constantius Chlorus happened to be at Eboracum, and he fell sick and he died. And immediately thereafter, his son, who was also present and also named Constantius, was proclaimed by the troops Augustus, emperor. There in Eboracum, Constantine, the one is proclaimed in York, and all certainly that event happened on the space on which York Minster now stands. Or you know the story of what follows. Shortly after that, some reckon it precisely on March 28th, 312. In battle, Constantine sees in the sky, you can just about make out that rather fanciful picture, sees a cross in the sky, and the words in Greek, en tuto nika, which means in this sign conquer. And that's very interesting because on my computer, before I emailed it over, that came out in a Greek font, and it's now come out in an English font, technical gremlins. But we know it more famously in the Latin, in this sign conquer, but the Greek is simply in this conquer. And things begin to happen. In 313, the Edict of Milan comes from the emperor promoting, not as I had thought, Christianity as an official religion. That was later in the century under a different emperor, Theodosius, practicing what we would recognize as an inalienable right today, religious tolerance. And at 314, one of the early councils of the church was convened in the southern French city of Arles, and the records clearly show in 314 that one of the bishops attending this council, which was principally convened by Constantine the Great to have the church deal with the Donatist heresy, but I'm not going to teach you about Donatism, somebody else can do that. But there is written clear evidence that a bishop from Eboracum was in attendance. So Christianity has seriously taken root in early York. Come on. I can't move too far away, I'm realizing. But then we hit the Dark Ages. 410 is the year that Roman soldiers are called back to Rome from the further flung parts of the empire, including, of course, Britain. And there's a steady decline in Britain of Roman civilization and a diminishment of Christianity in the country. Not a total extinction, but certainly the Christian presence begins to shrink. And we don't know much about that period because the Romans were literate and kept records, but at this point there are no written records really to tell historians what was going on. So the next thing that we really know in any concrete way is the re-establishment of Christianity in Britain, which happens at pretty much the same time, both from the south and from the north. Pope Gregory was keen to evangelize or re-evangelize England, having seen some rather attractive young blonde men in a slave market, and you may know the great joke he made about not angles but angels, and he was going to go off and evangelize the country, but rather inconveniently they elected him Pope, so he sent Augustine instead, who lands on the Kent coast in 597. Around the same time, missionaries from Ireland come to Iona on the Scottish west coast in 563, and thence through the ministry of St Aidan, they sent St Aidan to Lindisfarne, Holy Island in Northumbria in 634. So there's a pincer movement from both the north and the south re-evangelizing Britain. And very significantly, a princess from Kent down in the southeast where Canterbury is marries King Edwin of Deira, that's essentially modern-day Northumberland, and she brings with her her chaplain, who is a bishop called Paulinus. And in Britain, the Alpha course is a really popular thing. I think it's much less so over in the States, but you may have heard of it. I went to a talk at Holy Trinity Brompton in London, which is where Alpha emanates from. It was a conference, and it was fascinating because one of the slots in this two-day event were stories of people about how they had become Christians. And there were about 8 people from the congregation who were invited to speak. 4 of them were women, 4 of them were men. All 4 of the men admitted that their first introduction to the church was there was this young woman they took a shine to, and she said, "You don't lay a finger on me till you've become a Christian." But the Alpha effect goes well back before then, because Ethelberger basically said this marriage is only going to happen if you become a Christian. Chaplain Pauline, King Edwin in a wooden church, which is the first York Minster, and that was in 627. So you can and to a major 1400 anniversary. And York begins to grow in significance as a direct result. Edwin builds a stone cathedral, a Saxon cathedral, pretty quickly after his baptism. We know nothing about it. The Holy Grail to be discovered in York would be the remains of the Saxon cathedral. Some say that would be impossible because it's bound to be underneath the present minster. Others say that that's the last place it'll be, but nobody's found it, and we know nothing about it. In the 8th century, as I said a couple of minutes ago, York is made an archbishopric. Egbert, the bishop at the time, receives the pallium from the Pope, and since then, York has been an archbishopric. 866 sees the advent of the Vikings in England. They take York, but they don't ban Christianity, and the Christian religion is still present under the Vikings. And by the 10th century, the shape of York is pretty much as it is to be found today, certainly within the area marked out by its medieval city walls. In 1069, so by now we are just after the Norman Conquest, 1066, there was a pretty gruesome event called the Harrying of the North, and the Saxon cathedral is destroyed. But luckily there was a very impressive Norman Archbishop, Thomas of Bayeux, where the tapestry comes from, and he very quickly replaced the Saxon cathedral with a very splendid Norman cathedral. And he set up the kind of governance structure that we associate with cathedrals in the Church of England today, a chapter of canons whose income derives from what we call prebends. And that's, other than the income bit, has kind of continued across a millennium. Incredibly, the world knew almost nothing about the Norman cathedral until the modern era. In 1967, they discovered, to their horror, that the central tower of York Minster was literally about to fall down. That led to very rapid fundraising and very rapid work, and they put concrete reinforcements under it, and it was in doing that that they discovered the remains of the Norman cathedral. Now, I think quite a few of you were in Durham just this past summer. Basically, what was in York was something very similar to Durham. Now, I spent 10 years of my life in Durham, and I love the place. And for many, you might say that will be good enough. But not in York. I can come back. Because in 1212, a new archbishop arrives called Walter de Grey. And he probably made the most significant impact on the place. And it's then that the beginnings of the present Minster arise. He was in post for 40 years. When you consider the average lifespan in the 13th century, that was in itself quite an achievement. He pushed for the canonization of, of one of his predecessors from the previous century, William Fitzherbert, who was not once but twice Archbishop of York. There was a great row about whether or not he'd been validly elected, so he was kicked out and then he was brought back. And Walter de Grey gets William canonised in 1226. And he wants a cathedral fit to hold the relics of a saint. Now, we'll just ignore the fact that already in Durham, in a splendid Norman cathedral, there were the remains of St Cuthbert, who continues to this day to be far more talked about, revered, and far more popular than William. Nobody talks about St William, I'm afraid. But this was an excuse for Archbishop de Grey to say, I need a better cathedral. And the real theory, I'm not sure how often it's written down, but I think that he had cathedral envy as the Northern Archbishop. He wanted a bigger one than the guy in Canterbury had, and he got his way. So the construction of the present minster began in 1225, and it took a long, long time to be deemed to be ready to be consecrated. It was consecrated, as you can see there, July the 3rd, 1472. And here it is, I hope. That just gives you a little 20-second flavour of the enormity of the place. There we go. But what I want to get across, a lot of people arrive and they see that extraordinary building and they think, quite rightly, wow. And they look at it and they kind of think, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. And they kind of view it as a historical monument, and they forget what it really is. And they forget that in every age, it lives and breathes and changes. Now, in a parish that's only 100 and a bit years old, and as Father Deutsch was taking me around earlier, he talked about things that had happened and changes that had been made. I don't think change is a big shocker in a setting like this. It's harder for people to understand that a great Gothic cathedral can also change. There were two fires in the 19th century. In 1829, we lost the East End. Oh, right, that's interesting. Help. Right, I need somebody who knows what they're doing, because this has now come out of presentation mode. Actually, I might be able to do it. There we go. I managed it after all. So in 1829, an arsonist who was deemed to be insane and locked up in an asylum, an arsonist set light to the East End, and in 1840, just as they'd recovered from fire number one, accident saw the entire West End go up in flames. In both cases, the roof was completely destroyed and everything inside that half of the cathedral was gutted by the flames. And one of the things which delights me after... Come on, you can do this. Back in the 19th century, there was a strong sense that you replaced like for like. You tried to make it just as it was before. I don't know if any of you here have ever been to Moscow. I went a long time ago. I mean, I don't think any of us are likely to be visiting anytime soon. And I was there, in fact, attempting to lead a pilgrimage, looking at the Orthodox Church. And proudly in the centre of Moscow stands the Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. Now, it was destroyed by Stalin when Russia became communist, and religion was deemed a bad thing. And then, as things began to thaw, they rebuilt it. And they rebuilt it exactly as it had been before, which is quite an orthodox thing to do. In the Victorian era, that was their mindset as well, almost. And this is a delicious little hint about the fact that things change to reflect the age and the society they live in. There are wonderful roof bosses in the cathedral, and there's, I think it's 12 in the nave that tell the story of the Virgin Mary and of Jesus. And they had, luckily, somebody had done a study of them, so they had copies of what they all looked like, and they recreated them, except this boss of Mary feeding the baby Jesus. And being very Victorian, the idea of breastfeeding, an exposed part of the female anatomy, that was unthinkable to the Puritan Victorians. And so what they did, if you can see close up, Mary is bottle feeding Jesus. Every age leaves its mark, sometimes for good, sometimes it's a bit more questionable. And then in the lifetimes of many of us, on the 9th of July 1984, there was another fire. This time it hit the south transept where the famous rose window is. Intriguingly, it was 3 days after the consecration of the then Bishop of Durham. And I was in Durham at the time, I was a student there. And they elected as the Bishop of Durham an academic priest, a theologian who had been a professor of theology in a university for many years. And he wasn't used to dealing with the public and dealing with the press, and didn't immediately understand the kind of the pressures that come with becoming a public figure whose comments can be suddenly seized upon and used in all sorts of ways. And he said, before his consecration, in an interview to a paper, that his precise words were that the resurrection was more than a conjuring trick with old bones. But of course, the papers wickedly said, new Bishop of Durham says resurrection is a conjuring trick with old bones. And from a certain wing of the church, there was a great outcry. He was duly consecrated on July 6th, and 3 days later, this fire was caused by lightning. And again, of course, you'll have met some Christians who want to say that lightning is a sign of direct intervention by the Almighty. Most of us said, if the Almighty was that concerned, couldn't he have done it 3 days earlier on the day in question? But another major fire hits the Minster in 1984. And this time, I'm pleased to say, there was no sense of wanting just to recreate the past. And so here is a little bit of the United States. One of the new roof bosses marks the first man on the moon, who was, of course, a citizen of this country. And you can see the stars and stripes in his hand, immortalized in York Minster, at least until the next fire. So, kind of what I want to say, and I suppose I'm getting a bit preachy now, is that any living church, Epiphany Seattle or the Cathedral and Metropolitical Church of St. Peter in York, needs to honour the past in the present and for the future. And I'm pleased to say that the church that I've inherited is seriously trying to do that. One of the epoch-making things that York is famed for, we had in the Western Church, I think I'm right in saying, the first black archbishop a long time before Michael Curry was elected over here. It was in 2005 that John Sentamu, who came to Britain as a refugee from the Amin regime in Uganda, he was elected as Archbishop of York, and that certainly broke the mould. And come on, another picture. We rejoice in the fact that we were one of the first, not the absolute first, but one of the first English cathedrals to introduce girl choristers. And what is a great delight for me and a great boast that we make, some of our sister cathedrals find recruitment difficult, and they now have their front row is a mix of girls and boys. Some have a girls' choir that is markedly secondary, and they get the crumbs that fall from the table. Not so at York. We have 20 boys and we have a separate 20 girls, and day by day, and they sing 6 days a week, day by day they alternate. So if evensong on Tuesday is the girls, evensong on Wednesday is the boys, and so it is. We weren't quite the first, but we were the first, I think I'm right in saying we were the first English cathedral to get a full complement of both and treat them with absolutely equal status. York is a focal point for great occasions, unlike the Episcopal Church, partly because the Episcopal Church doesn't in the main have buildings of the same size that are necessary, but in the northern province, in the territory of the Archbishop of York, all bishops to be ordained are ordained in York Minster. And that photo of a particularly large scrum is the ordination in England. This is, well behind the times compared to you guys, but that was the ordination about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, of the first woman bishop in the Church of England, who happened to be called to serve in the northern province. You may know the great joke. A famous German theologian, I think in the 1930s, was visiting for the ordination of a friend of his as a bishop, and he had a kind of front row seat. And coming from a different church tradition, he'd not seen anything like this before. And he turned to his friend and said, "What are they doing now?" And the reply was, "I think they're removing his backbone." Which is a very unfair crack at those who become bishops. But the Minster is... the Minster serves not just its locality, but its whole province and region as being a focal point for great occasions. That was a major ecclesiastical event in the life of the... Oh, I've done it again. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. We also, very recently, were privileged to host the Royal Maundy, the occasion on Maundy Thursday when the British sovereign distributes Maundy money to pensioners who have had a life of sort of good service in their community. King Charles chose York to be the venue for his very first Royal Maundy. So there I am next to the King, or sandwiched between the King and the current Archbishop of York, at the end of the service, celebrating what was, I have to say, rather an extraordinary day, and a very wonderful one. I have become a great fan of King Charles, but that's a whole different story. So the Minster serves the region and in many ways the nation as being a focal point for very important occasions. It is also a focal point for great music. I've talked about our choir already. There you happen to see the boys' choir. Like many of the great English cathedrals, York is renowned for its music making, and it's had many very distinguished directors of music. Our current one, Robert Sharp, is at the head of that procession, has been in post about 15 years, and the choir is truly excellent. I'm a trained musician and I'm fussy about these things. The choir really is wonderful. And as I said, Noble, who composed the tune for that wonderful last hymn we sang, was one of his predecessors. Our organ is one of the best church organs in England. It was recently restored completely and rededicated in 2021, and is an absolutely magnificent instrument. So we certainly play our part in promoting the great Anglican choral tradition. Ooh. We also are doing something quite radical about trying to ensure the right kind of future, not just for the cathedral building itself, but for our locality. And we've done something in partnership with our local government authority that no other English cathedral has done in trying to create what we're calling a neighbourhood plan that looks at our whole precinct to try and make it fit for purpose in the future. You can see here, that's the actual cathedral, and the area you see, which is bounded in two parts by the medieval city wall, is our precincts, what's historically known as the Liberty of St. Peter, in which our own Minster police have authority and can arrest people, and where we are responsible for all the land and the buildings there. And essentially, we are trying to create both a heritage centre that can serve the entire world when it comes to the preservation of ancient buildings, stonemasonry and that kind of thing, and trying to make the place a sustainable, very green cathedral. So we are actively at this moment engaged in all sorts of things. We've just got approval to put 199 solar panels on part of the roof of the Minster. No other cathedral has done this. In the English church, you need legal permission to put a new light fitting in. When I was rector of a parish in the middle of England before Chicago, I had a lovely 15th century typical sort of English late medieval church, not the kind of church that would ever be in, 100 best churches or anything like that, but still a church that you would look at and think, wow. And it had a tower with a full ring of bells, and the bell ringers came to me and said, in the winter it's really cold in the ringing chamber. We'd like just to get a simple electric heater put on the wall. Not in public view, the kind of job that any competent electrician could do in a couple of hours. Getting permission for that took about 3 months and involves church lawyers and that kind of thing. So just imagine what a cathedral as famous as York Minster had to go through to get permission to put solar panels on the roof. But we got it, and when they are installed, that will generate about 30% of our heating and lighting. We are trying to be fit for purpose in a sustainable way. So we are building an extraordinary new stone yard that is going to be a centre, I can't spell, a centre of excellence for heritage skills in estate management. It's going to have one of the most modern state-of-the-art computer-controlled electronic saws for dealing with blocks of stone prior to our stonemasons then chipping away in time-honoured fashion. It's going to have room for 6 apprentices to live in simple accommodation while they train, because it is places like York that keep stonemasonry alive in Europe. The big English cathedrals are about the only reliable source of a living tradition of stonemasonry. We have a deeply inadequate building that houses an astonishing collection of manuscripts, books and artifacts, and when we find the right donor, we're going to build an extraordinary museum and learning centre which can display some of the treasures that have amassed over these 1400 years. And the inside of the Minster is actually very tatty, and it breaks my heart. Our altar platform is shabby. Our vestments are falling apart. I mean, you would hardly believe it in what is, in some ways, the second most important church in the country. The place needs a really good liturgical reordering. And our choral tradition, I'm very proud of it, as you will have heard, but it's under threat. It's under threat across the whole Church of England because the costs of running it and the costs of educating choristers rise by leaps and bounds, and we need to find an endowment, which we do not possess, to protect the choral tradition, which reaches out across the world. We sang a piece by Noble as the last hymn. The Anglican choral tradition is precious globally, I think it's fair to say. So I've arrived at a place that is really seeking both to preserve its legacy, but change its legacy so that it is a fit-for-purpose legacy to guide the future, and to do so in the service of God. So I kind of want to finish, as I talk, this is, come on, come to life. Right. Well, that is how our new stone yard is going to look. This is a 2-minute silent video I was going to have playing in the background, but I think we'll give up on that, looking at the time. But what I want to say is, in this we conquer was what motivated Constantine, and a change happened in York. And I want to show you the change as my last words. The red footprint, as you can guess from what I've said, is the garrison, the Roman garrison. And pre-Constantine, what happened in York, Christianity was an underground religion despised by the authorities who thought it was disruptive. They were out of focus. I talked about, in a sense, the need to be in focus in my sermon, for those of you that were at the 8:45. And as a result of Constantine and what happened in York, things got reorientated. And instead of being built in the same direction as the Roman garrison, which of course had its main street going up here and its secondary street like that, the cross, shall we say, was put upright. And the blue footprint is the medieval cathedral, the Norman cathedral, and the grey footprint is the Minster today. Things changed in York. Christianity was able, to use that phrase, to conquer. I'm not quite sure I really like the language of conquering. I'm not so much into the warfare side of it, but the very angle in which the Minster was built shows that in York something changed which impacted the whole world, from Constantine becoming emperor and becoming a Christian. And in this, we conquer to make a living church that serves the world. And I'll stop there, and I hope we've got time for some questions.
I know a number of us in the room have had the pleasure of spending time in York and seeing the remarkable Minster. What struck me, and I don't know if I had to set up for 11, so I may have missed it at the beginning, but the story of the discovery that the tower was listing and collapsing and what it took to get it righted.
I did touch on that.
And uncovering the garrison, the old Roman garrison, and the extraordinary job you all did with setting up in the Undercroft that remarkable exhibit, which is another gift to the world, I think, acknowledging, you know, that part of the history of that part of England.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that briefly. There's an irony that if we hadn't had this structural crisis, we would know nothing about the Norman Cathedral other than that it existed. You know, God is able, out of something which seems to be a disaster, to produce something that's good. And, you know, they rallied round, and the Minster stands proud to this day. But again, you know, you never know when the next challenge is around the corner, fire particularly. The microphone's just coming.
Are you getting the support of your community, and as you move forward with these plans? We hear a lot about the problems of the Church of England and the lack of community support.
We have the support. If by community you mean the worshipping community, we have their support, but this has been quite a shock for me because I've been a parish priest for 25 years of ordained ministry until I roll up at York. And for York, like all the old cathedrals in England, is not a parish church. It is extra-parochial. We have somewhere between 150 and 200 regular worshippers. And of course they pledge. But when you look at the size of the operation and of the needs of the operation, our congregational pledges are around or slightly under 1% of our budget. It is a different scale being responsible for something like this. I mean, for a start, I have very nearly 200 staff. And the Minster is a little bit like a three-headed dog. One of the heads is the architectural heritage. This building must be tended, must be maintained, must be preserved, must be enhanced. And that's a huge piece of work. There's all the physical fabric work, and in a sense all the legal side and the permissions and such like, which very rightly govern what you do with the building as precious as that. There's the tourist attraction side. It is the single most visited tourist attraction in the northern half of England, and it's a church. And there are tensions between those different bits of the organisation. The three heads don't always sing from the same song sheet for reasons that are understandable and valid, but nevertheless can be quite frustrating. So, the staff is vast, our salaries bill, is quite something, but the task of actually looking after the place goes well beyond that. I will say very unashamedly that I am in the process of creating the American Friends of York Minster, and I would certainly be delighted to have a discussion with anyone about that. And I think I would say that York's involvement in the story of Christianity across the world is not insignificant historically. So I want to say that my problems are your problems.
Regarding your visitorship as tourists that come to visit, what percentage of your operating budget do fees for people paying to come as tourists represent?
It's a very significant one. I can't remember the precise amount. I mean, it breaks my heart that we have to charge people to come in, but we're one of 12 cathedrals in England now that have had to do so. We've been doing it for 15 years, and if we didn't, the place would fall down. It's a high percentage, something like 60%.
With all your responsibilities, how do you divide your time between... And I see you're still standing.
It's been a fascinating 10 months in which I have principally been trying to work out what the dean of a major cathedral in England, what my job really is. And I mean, this has been the cause of a lot of soul searching, because there's a liturgical, ceremonial part of the job, except when the Archbishop is in the building. I'm the guy in charge, and I walk at the back of the procession, and they all bow to me, and I preside at some of the biggest liturgies and that kind of thing. That bit's obvious, but it doesn't take too much time. But I'm not a parish priest. I'm not the rector of a community like this. And boy, do I miss it. It's what I've done since I was ordained in the mid-1990s. One of my canons, I've got a team of 4 clergy who work alongside me. One of them is responsible for congregational nurture, discipleship and growth. So they're the nearest thing to a rector of a worshipping community. I'm a bit sort of above that. And one of the challenges is it's a highly professionalized environment, 200 staff. So anything that needs doing is done by professionals. So on a Sunday morning, we have volunteers, as you do here, who greet people when they come into the church. But we also have, if we're operating at full function, we have to have 15 paid members of staff on the floor of the Minster when we are open, because we can hold 2,000 people in the place, more if you push. And if there's a fire, we have a legal duty, of course, to be able to evacuate the place safely. And that takes a minimum of 15 staff. So everything is being complicated, and it's done in the main with great professional expertise. So it isn't my job to look at the accounts or to run the hosts on the floor or whatever it might be. Everyone is doing something else. And I've worked out that my job, A, is to nudge the place, to remind it in what it conquers, and that it is a place of Christian worship and tradition, and that is first and foremost what it's about, which, in the United Kingdom, if there is a real need, you can advertise for a job and say you must have a practicing Christian, but there has to be a legal justification for it. The only jobs of my 200 staff where that's true are the clergy, obviously, and our vergers, who assist with communion and that kind of thing. So I've got 190 people of all faiths or none who work for me, and they don't all instinctively get what the place is really about. So I think my job is to nudge it to hold fast to its first love, and then to step outside it and represent it as globally as I can. That's probably a good place to stop. Thank you.